The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
Welcome, everyone, to the Charlotte Podcast Festival week number, is this week 3?
This is week 3.
Week 3, holy cow. Time flies when you're having fun. Please remember to use hashtag CLT Podcast Fest when tweeting or Instagramming or whatever else you do on social media. Welcome to Charlotte Podcast Festival presented by WFAE, Charlotte's news source, Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclecs Creative Agency. My name is Joe Hunsaker. I'm an event manager and comedy producer at Blumenthal Performing Arts. I'm also a podcaster. I have a true crime pop culture podcast with my wife called American Timelines, and as well as a couple other ones and 100 more in the works because of this festival. And this session is Podcast Marketing 101 with WFAE's Joni Deutsch, right there to my, well, she's to my left, you're right.
I'm somewhere.
You're somewhere for everybody. Thanks for being here, Joni Deutsch. She is here to give you the best marketing tips and techniques. This is an hour-long session. The last 15 or so will be Q&A. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll keep track of them, and we'll ask them at the end. This truly will be we'll wait till the end. A lot of times I know I sneak questions in, but this time we're going to let Joni talk the whole time, and we're going to sneak the questions in at the end, because a lot of the questions you'll have will probably be addressed at later sessions this week, and she will give you those. But you can always check charlottepodcastfestival.com for the other sessions. This session will be recorded and made available as an archive session to those who have registered. It'll be sent out later this month via email. A short survey will be shared too, so please fill that out. That helps us get better. Be sure to check out the full list of sessions, like I said, at the festival website. You can also buy this cool t-shirt on the website. So please do that. That helps us and it helps you. You look cool. You make a lot of friends when you wear this. It's soft. Your pets can sleep with it, and you can advertise the festival, and it helps us, help support us. So thank you guys again for being here. Thanks for buying a shirt. But now let's go ahead and get started. Let me introduce Joni Deutsch to you. You guys probably all by now know Joni Deutsch because this is week 3 of the festival. She's been everywhere and on all these things, and she's been great. And even though she just got married, but let's talk about Joni Deutsch a little bit. She has been featured in Harvard's Nieman Journalism Lab, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Charlotte 5, the Charlotte Agenda, Creative Morning Charlotte, the Gantt Center, Blumenthal Performing Arts, Discovery Museum, and the Carolina School of Broadcasting. She has won awards from the Alliance for Women in Media, the West Virginia State Journal, the Online News Association, Charlotte Agenda, the United Way of Central Carolinas, Duke University. She is a podcasting superhero, an all-around great person. Please welcome my friend, who I always brag about knowing, the wonderful Joni Deutsch.
Oh, Joe, you're silly, but I like you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Joe, who's been a wonderful moderator to date and will continue to be as we are still in the 3rd week of the festival, so still about a week and a half. So I hope that you're able to check out the full remaining list of sessions and register for them. They're all free. What other session would you be able to attend from somewhere else in the world for free for an entire month? So thank you for everyone who's attending. Yes, as Joe mentioned, my name's Joni Deutsch. I am podcast lead at WFAE. I've been helping the festival. I love audio, been working in it in about a decade now at various NPR stations with various podcast productions. One of the things I love about audio is how it connects individuals. And this is why we're here today, Marketing 101, Podcast Marketing 101, because at the end of the day, you could have a great idea, But if no one knows about it, or if you don't know how to connect your idea to the right audience, the target audience, then you're kind of shouting into a void, which, I mean, relatable, right? Pandemic, the last 8 months, we feel like we're shouting into a void, but you don't need to feel that way with podcast marketing. So that's why we're here today. I'm going to share with you all kinds of tips and tricks I've learned and used in my line of work with different podcasts and being able to promote them and being able to get them featured nationally, internationally, and just in all honesty, connecting with an audience who feels like this is their story and they want to become a brand advocate for your podcast and share with others. So again, this session is recorded, and the presentation I'm about to share will also be shared with you, the PowerPoint slides. So just keep that in mind. And if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll answer them when we get towards the end of the hour. So give me 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Beautiful. All right. So Podcast Marketing 101 with me, Joni Deutsch. I'm named after my dad. His name's John. They put an I at the end of it and they called it a day. So of course you can follow me on social media, and I love to stay in touch with you. Today, as I just shared, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to learn how to strategize your target audience to maximize your marketing potential. We're going to show ways to successfully promote your podcast, no matter your genre, no matter your years of experience, no matter if you're a 1-person team or a team of 20. If you're a team of 20, let me know how that works out, because that sounds amazing, and how to grow your audience. And we're also going to share a resource list. And by resource list, I mean this PowerPoint presentation and this recording. So again, PowerPoint presentation is going to go out tomorrow or later today. The recording will go out at the end of the month. So marketing. When you think of marketing, you may think of a few different things because it's kind of a nebulous term. You know, it's just strategic communications. I'm going to share this quote that I think sums up why we're here today, why I love and have degrees in marketing. At a fundamental level, marketing is the process of understanding your customers and building and maintaining relationships with them. Yes, marketing can be paid marketing. You pay to be able to share your words or ideas with the world, whether that's a sponsored post or an ad or a billboard. Yes. But it isn't just yelling at people, listen to me, look at my stuff. It's finding authentic relationship building mechanisms, finding ways to truly connect with your audience so that when you say, I suggest you listen to my podcast, they can actually say, yeah, I can see why you'd say that. And I am interested and I do want to listen. No matter your organization size, your podcast popularity, the genre that you're working in, marketing is a critical component to audience growth and success. I'm not saying it's the #1 thing you should focus on as a podcaster, because let's be honest, you're probably a 1-person team. So you're going to be the host, the interviewer, the editor, marketer, sponsorship lead, everything. I'm not saying marketing should be at the top of the list of what you need to do. But what I'm going to share with you in a little bit is an idea that can help you make your marketing stronger, even if you are a 1-person team. And I want to say too, that I'm going to share with you a lot of different ideas in the next 40 minutes. There are several types, there's several strategies, there's several tactics of marketing when it comes to marketing. I am not saying that everything on this list is going to be applicable to your production. I'm not saying that you should do everything that's suggested. What I'm saying is that maybe you should listen and figure out which ones are going to be the ones that are easiest for you to look into, the things that are going to be the most connective when it comes to your audience and your content. So at the end of the day, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy for podcast marketing. It's something that you learn as you go along and can continue to grow and evolve as your podcast production and your audience continues to grow and evolve. So I want to just say those little caveats before we get started. So before you create a marketing strategy, I would suggest that you consider 3 questions. What are your resources is the #1 question. And when I say resources, I mean, how much time do you have to devote to marketing? How much of a budget do you have? How many teammates or individuals working alongside you or with you or ones you could hire? How many of them do you have? I say that because you may consider your podcast a passion project. And a passion project in the sense that you don't really want to invest a ton of money into it, but you have a ton of time to do that. So maybe you focus on some of the strategies I'll share in a bit that are more on the free side, or things that are a little easier to do. If you do have a budget though, maybe that's an ability for you to invest some more into marketing, whether that's hiring a social media manager or, investing in a program or a, earned ad or paid ad or sponsored post on social media. And your teammates, that's another resource, right? If you do have the ability to have a partner, a co-host, a producer, an editor, a social media marketing manager, all the better. That's lovely. But if you don't worry. We have ideas in here of how you can do this solo and not go insane from the process of doing all the work by yourself. So that's one question, is what are your resources going into your marketing strategy? And just in general, your podcast strategy, right? The second question I have for you though, and something we're going to dive into in just a bit, is who is your target audience? And I say that because that's important for your podcast production and knowing who you're making this content for. It's also important for you in understanding how should you target your marketing strategy to that target audience. Otherwise, you will be throwing all the ideas onto a wall and hoping that one of them sticks, given who your audience is going to be for your podcast content. And when you know who your target audience is, then you need to know, where are they? What are they doing? Where do they go for information? So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth here. Again, as we're thinking of our marketing strategy, before you start creating, printing out stickers and t-shirts and creating social media handles on all the different platforms, what I would suggest you do is go ahead and consider, who is your target audience? And by that, I mean, what is their age range? If you think of your target audience, the ideal person who's listening to your podcast, and in all honesty, not everyone in the world is going to be listening to your podcast, because that's not really how podcast works, unless you're The Daily or a true crime podcast. So again, who is your target audience? What is their age range? Is it more millennial, Gen Z, young professional? Is it more retiree? Is it, between the ages of 35 and 50 with children? Tell me. Who is their age range? What is the age range? Where do they live? What is their location? Is it a certain neighborhood? Is it a city? Is it a state? Is it a country? What is their job or jobs, or the sector that they reside in, career-wise, professional-wise? Do they commute to work? If so, do they do it with car? Do they do it with bus, train, light rail, bicycling? Do they participate in any groups or clubs? Because that can give you an indication of how they spend their time after hours, and maybe ways for you to know, based off their interests, I know where to go to market to those individuals. What are their information sources? Where does your target audience go to for news and information and entertainment? Is it social media? And if so, what kind of social media? Because there's tons of social media out there. Do they go to print? Do they go to magazines or newspapers for their information? Do they go to email newsletters, podcasts, television, local businesses? Do they shop at them or buy coffee at them? All of this information is going to be good for you to know, because again, you're catering your podcast to them. You want to know, if my target audience is over here to the right, then I shouldn't focus my target, my marketing on all things over here to the left that don't relate to them. It makes sense. You want to try to find where your audience is, and then you can create marketing tactics. They're going to find them and bring them over to you in your podcast. So again, these answers are going to help you understand your listeners' interests and where you can effectively market your podcast. And for those just joining us, welcome again. We're going to have questions at the end of the hour. So feel free, if you have any questions about marketing and podcasting, feel free to put them in the comments. So if you have, some more questions about how to determine who your target audience is and what kind of content you're making for them and how to connect with them, I'm going to give 2 quick resources that you can look into further. One is NPR training. NPR, National Public Radio, they have a free resource called NPR Training, where they have a project blueprint. It's like a 16-page PDF that you can fill out. It really helps you not only figuring out your content, but also considerations for audience building, audience growth, sponsorship, logos, competitive research. So I highly recommend it. It's free. Just search for NPR Training Project Blueprint. Of course, this PowerPoint presentation will be provided to everyone here, so you can check out the link as well when you receive the PowerPoint. And if you want a case study example, we did this with the podcast I produce at WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, and it's called Amplifier, and it's a music podcast. So what you'll see on here on the screen is a screenshot of 3 target audiences, and I basically go in depth about their age, why they are looking for a podcast, where they go to for information. And that kind of information is then able to go into our marketing campaign so we know how to effectively reach out to them and bring them on as new listeners. So again, link to be able to see this case study is in the PowerPoint presentation. So this is the slide that is my favorite one to show when I do these presentations about podcast marketing. It has about 40 some ways to market to podcast, or market with podcast, or market to get podcast listeners in. We're going to go in depth about a number of these, but really quickly, this slide is one where you could take any number of these tactics and use them to connect your content with your target audience. So I'm just going to rattle them off real quick, and you can see that there's a lot of potential here. Hashtag social media handle, earned media with local and national television news, newspapers, email newsletters, Facebook Live, Instagram Live, Medium post, blog the process, physical mailers, award considerations, influencer marketing, swag, press release, influencer marketing again because influencers are great, Reddit AMA discussion, email podcast guests, YouTube podcast audio, appear/be interviewed on another podcast, Google AdWords, billboards, create a website landing page, ads in local media, illustrations and GIFs, cross promo with similar podcast, contact podcast writers and critics, event, whether in person or during a pandemic, virtual, podcast trailer, attend or speak at conferences, podcast events, local meetups, etc. Purchase business cards with your podcast information on them, social media ads, signal boost. That means letting your mom know you have a new podcast and she should share it with everyone. Radio, you can create your podcast, turn it into a radio special and share that with radio stations to air. Cross promo with other podcasts, social media banners, graphics, including quotables and audiograms, subway bus ads, email signatures, contest giveaways, post in specific Facebook groups dedicated to your topic or interest in your podcast. Create a VIP ambassador program. Ask for podcast ratings and reviews, ads in third-party podcast apps like Overcast or Simplecast, etc. I rattled off a long list here. I know that can seem a little daunting, but I just want you to know this is a brainstorm process. When you know where your target audience is, give yourself 10 minutes and a piece of paper or a whiteboard, and just go crazy with the number of ways you can connect with them based off of their interests, based off where they go for information, based off how they use or where they go to for social media. Just have fun with it. After 10 minutes, then decide, okay, which ones are the ideas I want to start working on for marketing potential? So now what we're going to do is we're going to go and do a little deeper dive into some of these little subsections of podcast marketing ideas. So considerations for marketing when it comes to website and landing pages. I'm going to be honest here, folks. A lot of podcast listening doesn't take place on websites. It doesn't take place on browsers on your computers. It takes place on smartphones. It takes place in apps on your phones, like Apple Podcast app or the Spotify app. But with that said, while many podcast listeners use smartphones to listen to audio, a website or a landing page will help optimize the podcast for search engines, which will attract more traffic from Google searches or Firefox searches, you name it. So even though technically your listenership is not going to be on the website in the download stream sense, it's good to have a place that you can call home so that you can direct people to wfae.org/amplifier or insertpodcastnamehere.com. It's good to have something like that. So you can create a digital home for your podcast, which is a great marketing tool for you in a few ways. And you can do so for free or relatively in an inexpensive way with sites like Wix, W-I-X, or WordPress. You could use a social media site like Facebook or Tumblr, but at the end of the day, you don't own Facebook and you don't own Tumblr. You don't own those social media sites. You want something that if for whatever reason Mark Zuckerberg says, oh, we're going to just shut this down, similar to MySpace, where not a lot of people are on MySpace anymore. Create something that's going to be consistent, that's going to be yours, that you can kind of retain some rights to in the future. So that's just a consideration for creating a digital home for your podcast. And a great thing about podcast websites is that you're able to do anything with them. You can use them in any sense of whatever kind of podcast you're making. You can curate all your episodes onto the one page, and you can include show notes. When I say show notes or liner notes, I mean basically either a partial transcription or little reference points to things that are happening in your episode, to say at the 11:04 mark, we talk about this newspaper article, and here's a link to the newspaper article. Or at 12:04, we talk about this previous guest on the podcast, and here's a link to the previous guest on the podcast. That's great in boosting your SEO or search engine optimization with keywords that if a podcast listener were to search on Google for, depending on how many hits you have on your website, your podcast or episode may be in that first or few pages of the Google search results. So again, you can put all kinds of things in your website, your social media handles, subscription options to where they can find your podcast audio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, ways for them to connect with you further. Maybe you have an embed, a Google form embed where they can share ideas, they can leave comments, even ways that they can watch you live. If you're doing an event, you can sell tickets through your website or have merchandise or swag. So again, website landing page, great marketing tool, great call out for you to have in a website or on your podcast to say, check us out on our website. Considerations for marketing with social media. The biggest question I receive as someone who works in audio and podcasting for about a decade is, should I have a social media handle for my podcast on every single platform? Should I have it on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, TikTok, you name it, everywhere? And to that I say, you can. Look, social media handles are free, right? Go ahead and own the domain for your podcast title on all the platforms. So that way, at least you call it, it's yours. No other podcast is going to come in with the same name and take it. But that doesn't mean you necessarily need to have it everywhere, right? As I mentioned at the start, you are maybe a one-person operation, or maybe you're working with limited resources, not to mention limited time. We're all busy individuals, even during quarantine. If the podcast is your number one thing that you're doing, maybe you have time to devote to being able to post on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on all the platforms. But realistically, you need to ask yourself, is your target audience, which we've been talking about for a bit, are they on all the platforms? Are they on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter? Because if you look at the stats, if you look at Pew Research, that's PEW Research, or other research firms, what you'll likely find is that an audience of a younger generation, 30 and younger, they're probably not on Facebook as much. They're probably on Twitter or they're on Instagram. So if that's your target audience for your podcast, should you waste your time and money on other platforms when you know your target audience is on Instagram and Twitter? So that's the consideration I'd give for you. Try to figure out who is your target audience and what social media platform are they going to be on, and then focus on that instead of splitting your time across 10, 20 different platforms, which all have different ways of sharing content. You can create a hashtag. Create a hashtag that you feel like is appropriate with your podcast and encourage people to use it when talking about it. I would also say too, this is a great opportunity to go down the rabbit hole of which tags are relevant to your topic and your podcast. If you do a podcast that's about Halloween or spooky critters or creatures or ghosts, check out one of those hashtags on Instagram or Twitter. Do the hashtag ghost, do the hashtag October. See what other similar hashtags are going to pop up in relation to it. Create a list on a Google Doc or your phone app, memo app, and just write down every single hashtag that's related to the topic or the guest that you bring on your podcast, and just keep a running note of it. And then when you post on social media, especially when you post on Instagram, which allows for multiple hashtags, go ahead and put those in the caption. And that way that broadens your audience. So you're reaching into those channels where they're having those conversations. The same holds true with Facebook groups, with Reddits. If you're a fan of Reddit, which is basically kind of a microblogging site, there are thousands and thousands and thousands, probably a million different subreddits or different groups of topics and conversations. If you know what kind of topic you're making, tap into that. Tap into the conversations taking place on subreddits, on Facebook groups, on specific social media accounts, and say, hey, I see that you're talking about this topic and I actually have a podcast about it. Or I see that you're talking about this person and I actually just interviewed them on my recent episode. And that way you're sharing it with that target audience who already show an interest in what you've done as a podcaster. One other thing I would just say for social media considerations is that whatever you do, how many of social media platforms you're on, determine the best time to post and post consistently. We're not all on social media at the same time every single day. Your target audience, depending on who they are, may be on earlier in the morning, maybe on around lunch, maybe on later at night. If you're international, you obviously know what time they would be on as well. So you can use schedulers, especially free schedulers like TweetDeck, or ones that cost a little bit more money, like Hootsuite, to be able to schedule your social media posts for you so you don't have to be up at 3 in the morning, or you don't have to make sure you press schedule or post on a post exactly at the time it should be up. And I would say post consistently too. The rule of thumb in podcasting or in social media podcasting is that you try to post a few times per episode. Because if you only post once when your episode goes up, then the person may not see, or the target audience may not see. Sometimes it takes a few times for us to see something, So I would just say do multiple posts per episode. And also, when you're linking out to that episode in the post, just know that not everyone listens to podcasts on Apple. Not everyone listens to podcasts on Spotify. So do a range of links. For one social media post, when you're promoting an episode, include a link to the Apple Podcast page for your podcast. For another social media post, include a link to something that's a little bit more Droid or Samsung or non-Apple specific for a podcast link. Maybe Radio Public, maybe Google Podcast. That way you're kind of creating the broad spectrum. You're allowing for all of the listeners to learn that you're available everywhere, not just on Apple Podcast. Considerations for social media graphics when it comes to marketing. We have a session coming up today and also later this week about social media podcast marketing. So I'm going to go into this pretty quickly because they're going to go more in depth. But there's so many ways for you to transform your podcast audio content into things that are visual, that are going to be eye-catching for people on social media or in different groups to promote your podcast. You can transform notable quotes or moments of your interview into quotables, which are basically what I just have on the screen right now. You take a quote from your podcast, you put into a nice little graphic, you make it visual. Canva is a great way to be able to do that for free. It's a program online called Canva. You can create audiograms, which you maybe have seen, maybe you haven't, but it's when you take a snippet of your podcast audio and you transform it into a visualization. So it looks like a waveform going through a short video. I'm trying to do a little wave with my hand right now in case you're wondering what I'm doing. You can use programs like Wave, that's WAVVE, or Headliner. And all you have to do is just upload the small little snippet of your podcast audio, a great snippet, an ear-catchy snippet, and it'll create something visual for you to share on social media. You can create episode-specific artwork of the interview of your guest, as you can see on my screen right here, where for the music podcast I host, Amplifier, we take a photo that the musicians give to us that is okay to use, and we put a filter, a frame on it, so it's branded of our podcast with the person's name that we interview, in this case, Hope Nichols, as she looks amazing in her 80s photo. So you can create a specific episode artwork, which I'm going to share in a second, is important because at the end of the day, if you have people that are on your podcast, you're tapping into their networks and marketing to their networks because you're hoping they're going to share their podcast with their social media communities, with their email newsletters, with their friends and family and peers. So when you have something eye-catching, that's going to be able to tap into them even further. It's going to make your guest feel like, wow, I was important. I'm a part of this production. Of course, you can create GIFs. There are free ways to do that on Giphy, Giphy. And you can also create podcast banners for your social media, Facebook banner, Twitter banner, you name it, and upload them to your personal Facebook, Twitter, social media account so people know you're official. You're a podcaster now. So as I mentioned, considerations for marketing when it comes to tapping into the potential of your guest. When you have a guest on your program, don't just have it where you have them on, you record the interview, and you're done. You never reach out to them again. Because one thing that we talked about last night, if you were there on our call, our session about community building, is that we're all busy. And we're all probably thinking, okay, we have this interview, and now we're focusing on the 20 other things happening with friends and family and work and life. So after an interview happens, email your guest and let them know, hey, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm going to share some information with you about how to subscribe to the podcast so you can have it first thing when it's available. And here's some social media copy. And here's the date that the episode is going to go live so you can promote it to your friends and family and peers. And here's a podcast graphic or logo you can use in promoting it. Send it to them after the interview's done. And then when the interview or episode's about to go live, send them another email saying, hey, thank you so much for the interview that took place last week, last month, last year. Wanted to let you know that your episode is going live tomorrow, or it's gone live today. And I'm attaching some social media graphics. I'm attaching some quotables. I'm attaching a audiogram. I'm attaching episode artwork with your face and your name on it. Feel free to share on social media. In fact, I'm going to share with you some social media copy. All you need to do is copy it into your social media platform and hit publish and share it with the world. All that's helpful. And sometimes the person is thankful that you did all the work for them and making them look good, sound good, and promote it well. And of course, you should tag your guest and their organizations and whatever hashtags are relevant to their line of work and conversation on social media. All right, so podcast considerations for cross promo. Cross promotion is one of the best, it's one of the most effective ways to market, to be able to bring in a new audience, to be able to grow an audience. Word of mouth is one of the best ways, and also it's one of the freest ways in terms of expenses. It shouldn't cost you anything to do this. So when I say cross promotion, what I mean is you finding a podcast, whether it's in the same region as you, whether it's with a similar topic as yours, your podcast production in total, or an episode you're doing. It's finding a podcast that maybe has a similar audience as from what you can see, and you reaching out to the podcast or podcast and saying, hey, I want to do a cross promotion with you. I want to promote your podcast in my podcast feed, and you, the other podcaster, do the same where you're promoting mine. So for instance, if I'm a music podcast, and I'm Amplifier, I can reach out to another music podcast in another state and say, hey, why don't we cross promote? If you give me a few lines of text to promote your podcast, I will promote it either in my pre-roll, my mid-roll, my post-roll, or somewhere in my podcast. I'll send you some of my script promoting my podcast with some talking points, and you can do the same over in yours. And we can confirm which dates or how many episodes we're each going to promote it in. I mean, the best comparison is if your favorite celebrity out there or your favorite family member says, I just discovered the best ice cream. It is so amazing, and I want you to taste it. It's so great. I've been drinking it, eating it all day, every day. So awesome. And you take their word at heart because you trust them and you like them. It's the same thing with podcast cross promotions. When you as the host is saying, hey, you're listening to me because you like me or you like the content I create, I want to let you know of another great podcast over here that does something just as cool. Your audience is going to say, if I trust you for your content, I'm going to trust your opinion. I'm going to try out that other podcast and see if it fits. So don't be willy-nilly. Don't just promote any other podcast. Be targeted. Know exactly why you're promoting it, because you don't want to be the person where an audience comes up to you saying, why did you promote the podcast about like this really weird item over here that had nothing to do with your production? So again, be intentional with your marketing and your cross promotions. But what you can do is have a podcast promotion in the beginning of your podcast, the pre-roll, somewhere in the middle of your podcast, the mid-roll, or the post-roll at the very end. And if you say it yourself as the host, that even brings more seriousness or more weight to that recommendation. Another way to do a cross promotion with another podcast is if you do an episode swap where one of your episodes, you can give it in its entirety of an episode to that similar podcast production, and they put it into their feed. They can create a little bit of an intro saying, hi, I'm Elizabeth, and today on the podcast, we're actually doing something different, something special. We're letting one of our music podcast friends, Joni Deutsch, share an episode of hers that we think you're really going to like. So enjoy this special broadcast of Amplifier on our podcast feed. A little bit of context helps. But you can episode swap. They can provide a podcast episode to you. You could do the same for them, or it could just be a one-way transaction. And transaction in the sense that it's free, but it's a way to kind of encourage conversations and audience growth. Another way to do cross promotions is you simply interview the person. Invite the other guest onto your podcast to talk about what they do, and they can invite you on theirs to talk about what you do. And that way, their audience is able to see a little bit about who you are as a host and what you do as a podcaster. And of course, you could do cross-promotion on social media. Give them a shout out. Say, hey, I'm going to shout you out on my social media, on Twitter, on Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you want to do the same, here's some social media graphics and language. You're welcome to do that. And again, for those in the audience, a reminder that this session is being recorded. If you have any questions about anything that's covered or any kind of marketing ideas, feel free to put them in the comments. We're going to start the Q&A probably in the next like 5-10 minutes. So considerations for marketing when it comes to pitching yourself for interview and feature. We have a really great session coming up tomorrow at the Charlotte Podcast Festival about PR. I'd highly recommend signing up for it on charlottepodcastfestival.com, but just very briefly, absolutely don't say no to yourself. You may feel like you don't have anything that's newsworthy to talk about, but go ahead and pitch your idea. What's the worst that can happen? They don't respond, they say no, that's okay. You went ahead and shot your shot, and who knows, maybe it could work out. So yes, find local media outlets, find the contact information for local reporters, local magazines, newspapers, TV, radio shows, likewise for national media. But what I'd recommend you do is find the right reporter, find the right writer, find the right topic that they're covering that relates to what you're doing. Again, intentional. You don't want to just naturally say, hey, here's my podcast. And they're like, well, I write about biology and you have a podcast about Pez dispensers. So why did you pitch me this podcast feature? Be intentional about what you're going to do and how you're going to pitch yourself. And also look up what that local news outlet or the national news outlet or the reporter or writer has previously done. Is there a topic in there that relates to what you're doing? And you could say, hey, I saw that you wrote previously about XYZ topic, and that's actually similar to what I do as a podcast, which I'm launching, or which I'm celebrating the 10th episode, or first year, or 10th year, or 1,000th subscriber. Do you want to do a feature on me? Again, intentional. Make it an easy yes. You could also reach out to email newsletters, whether it's a regional newsletter, a news heavy newsletter, maybe a podcast newsletter. There are a ton of podcast newsletters out there that could write about your show launch or an interesting topic you're working on, an anniversary. So I've listed some in the slideshow here: Pod News, Hot Pod, Pod Mauve, Podcast Gumbo, Inside Podcasting, Bellow Collective. They are all podcast critics and writers that write about podcast news and releases. You can find similar podcasts in the region. And again, pitch yourself as a guest on their podcast saying, hey, I'm newsworthy, I'm noteworthy, I'm doing something that's interesting, I'm a cool personality, I could be a guest on your podcast. And one thing I'd recommend too, as we talked about website design earlier, a great thing to put on your website beyond the podcast audio, show notes, liner notes, social media handles, way to subscribe, all that. Another thing to put on your website is a press packet. Create a one sheet, as they call it, with your information on it, who you are as a host, a paragraph about what kind of podcast you do, some, logos for your podcast. So that way, if someone in a news outlet were to stumble across your work and want to feature you, they could easily get all that information on your website in one location with that one sheet or that press packet or the little tab on your website that has all that information laid out easily. So considerations for marketing when it comes to turning your podcast episodes into YouTube videos. We talked about SEO, search engine optimization, earlier in this session. And again, if you're just joining us, the recording of this will be made available later this month. But what you want to try to do is get on the radars of people that are looking for you. YouTube is the second biggest search engine. So if people are looking at dog content on YouTube and you have a dog podcast, a good way to get your podcast audio into their search results is to go ahead and upload your audio into YouTube. That way it's going to create an SEO strategy. And if they search for dogs or dog podcasts, they may happen upon yours and you're exactly what they're looking for a target audience. So a good way to do that, to create video content out of your audio, if you have no video, if you're not creating a video podcast to begin with, you're doing only audio, you can still create video for YouTube. You can create an audiogram. We mentioned that just a bit ago with social media. Do so by using the app Headliner, which is free, and that'll create a visualization of your audio. You can also use an audio to video service. Libsyn has that potential if you use Libsyn in distributing your podcast audio, or an app like repurpose.io. And there's a few other ones out there. I'm just giving you just a couple recommendations for you to look into. Okay, so we're almost done. We have about 5 more minutes left, and then we're going to get to Q&A. So considerations for emails. I would say go ahead and create an email address for podcast communications, for podcast marketing initiatives, a Gmail address, or you can do a nonprofit address that's to a domain like your website. And that way it's specifically for your podcast when you're marketing it and trying to reach out to listeners and fans. You can add a banner or an episode link to the signature of your personal email saying, I host this podcast, check it out here. And also you can encourage listeners to sign up for an email newsletter. Maybe it's a way to connect with them even further so that you have a even deeper relationship with text, giving them updates about a new episode coming out or events that you're hosting or just your musings related to the topic you host. And you can create an email newsletter on MailChimp or other email newsletter sources. Maybe not something you want to start out at the get-go as you're building up an audience, but if you get to the point where you want to market even further, then go ahead, create an email newsletter and encourage your audience to share it with their friends and family and grow an audience from it. If you're doing paid advertising, and again, depends on your resources and budget, you can do sponsored posts on social media, again, targeted to the people that you're wanting. So don't have a post on LinkedIn if your target audience is not on LinkedIn. But you can also do advertising on Google AdWords. Google AdWords is the first little ads that pop up on Google when you search for a key term or phrase. So there are nonprofit grants, if you want to look into it, that allow for Google AdWords to take place. Again, you just need to search for Google AdWords nonprofit grant and see if you can apply for one and get one and promote your podcast with Google AdWords. You can buy billboards that are affordable through services like Blip, that's B-L-I-P, if you know that your target audience likes to commute or likes to travel through certain cities, states, regions. And you can purchase ads in podcast apps like Overcast and Stitcher. Because look, if they are a podcast fan, they're going to be in a podcast app and you can let them know we have a podcast for you on this app. Considerations for being featured in a podcast app, because I think we have a lot of people here wondering, how can I get featured on Apple Podcasts? How can I get featured on Spotify? I'm not going to give you the exact formula because sadly there isn't one. Surprisingly, Spotify and Apple Podcasts don't really want everyone in the world to know how to get featured in their app in the new and noteworthy section or in the little carousel at the top of the screen. But some rules of thumb. You want to have an audience kind of built up by the time you launch your podcast. And you can do that by creating a social media account, letting people follow you, letting them know like, hey, the podcast is coming out soon. Make sure you follow us, stay in the know. And you want to make sure you have a podcast teaser or trailer uploaded first in your podcast feed. Something that's like an indication, like a movie trailer or a television promo that kind of gives people a sense of what the series is going to be about. Because Apple Podcasts and the other apps, they like to consider themselves like movie and television show production companies, which makes sense because they kind of are now. You're going to want to put the links to those podcast directories on your website prominently to show that you're all on board on promoting that your podcast is on Apple, on Spotify. And you're going to want to encourage your listeners to download, subscribe, and rate and review the podcast within the first month of launch. That's the key thing. Apple Podcasts and Spotify and the other apps, they take in if your podcast is doing well, if it's showing traction in the first few weeks, the first month, that's an indication to them that you should be featured on their app if you're doing well enough, if you have enough people that are listening, that are downloading, that are subscribing, and that are leaving ratings and reviews. So my recommendation is in the first month that you put an episode out or your first episode, encourage people to listen and rate and review. And if you have to incentivize it with swag, go for it. So other considerations for connecting with your audience, because at the end of the day, you're using marketing not as a way to sell your product. In a small sense, yes, but as a way to be able to find the right audience and to show them that this is something that's worth their time. When there's so many things out there distracting them or using up their time, this podcast is worth their time. So it's a two-way communication. It's not just you hosting a podcast. It's not just you talking. It's the audience listening. It's the audience responding, and a relationship is forming. So ways to kind of use marketing tactics to connect with your audience further. Encourage podcast ratings and reviews. Encourage email comments to your specified email address. Voice memos or ways for them to send a Google voicemail. You can set up a free Google voicemail and they can leave you a voicemail. Or social media comments. They leave comments on social media. All of those things, say them back on your podcast episode. Say, hey, if you leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts, when you rate us or review us, if you send us an email, if you leave us a voicemail, if you leave us a social media comment on our channel, we may mention you in an upcoming podcast episode. So feel free to let us know how you liked today's episode. Give us feedback on what you didn't like or something funny that's happening in your life, and we'll try to include you, or we'll reach out in an upcoming episode. And that way it's finishing up that feedback loop of them sharing and you responding. Other ways to connect with your podcast fans, you can embed a Google form, Opinery poll, little engagement techniques into your website that people can then either connect with. They can like share their input. They can, add their email address, comments, ways to kind of engage them. So they're not just listening, they're able to do some like fun little activities. You can engage them with live or virtual events, whether it's a Zoom hangout or maybe eventually a live event. Swag giveaways, or have a merchandise shop where you can sell t-shirts and mugs and things. A listener feedback survey where you're actually asking them, hey, we have a survey that we'd love for you to fill out. The link is on our website. If you fill it out, we'll be able to enter you into a raffle for a t-shirt. The listener feedback survey is critical because you're able to get from them information like, how did they discover your podcast? Which marketing technique worked in getting them through the door and finding out about you? So then you can determine, should you do more of that in the future or less of it if it didn't work out? And also, what do they like about the podcast? How much are they listening to it? Are they listening to it entirely or just the first few minutes? Do they like a certain topic or guest you brought on? It's all helpful. And of course, Patreon and Kickstarter, you can encourage monetary support. We have a couple sessions about that later next week at the festival. So final thoughts before we start the Q&A. Your podcast is up to you. I gave you a lot of thoughts, a lot of marketing techniques and tactics for your consideration. But at the end of the day, you can market on any budget. You can change your budget. You can change your promotional strategies. You don't have to keep it the same thing each and every week, each and every month, each and every year. Your podcast is going to grow. Your audience is going to grow. It's going to start off small and it's grow big and big and big eventually. So just keep at it. Keep brainstorming, keep experimenting, keep pivoting. And don't be afraid to try new things. And also track your success. Sweet listener comments that you're getting in, press that you're getting, awards that you're winning. Keep track of it. And then at the end of the year, at the end of the season, you can say, this is what I did well. And I'm really proud of what we did together. And that's the presentation. And I can't wait for all the questions, Joe.
Joni, Deutsch, you are the best. Oh my God, information overload.
Yes.
But exciting and awesome. And I've got 100 notes here. I've got 100 tabs open on my browser because I am terrible at, this is the part, I love podcasting. I love making them. I like putting them out. I'm terrible at the marketing. So this is like, and these are all things I should be doing. I should already have done. But thank you for all of this. This is so great. A lot of positive comments, but I'm going to jump into the questions right away so we can try to get to all of them.
Let's do it.
Okay, so going back from the beginning at 12:17 p.m., Sapna, I hope I'm saying that right, says her target audience, or his, I don't know what gender Sapna is. So their target audience is Gen Z and millennial environmentalists. How can I effectively gather data to find out if I am indeed reaching them?
Well, I would say first thing to do is for that person asking with Gen Z, millennial, environmental, where is that audience automatically going for that information? And just to be sure, like, are they going to a certain resources, social media accounts, influencers, all that? It's good to compile that into a Google Doc and be able to just see, okay, I'm going to, from this list, see if I can pitch to these, media outlets for coverage or cross promo or whatever the case may be. So track your successes and the rate that you're going. But the other thing I'd say is, depending on where you're distributing your audio, if you're using Libsyn, if you're using, I'm trying to think of the other ones, Podbean, Simplecast, some of these podcast distributors will give you great analytics. They'll tell you where in the world your podcast listenership is, what the audience demographic is in terms of age. So that can give you an indication of how successful you are based on that alone. But back to my fairly recent slide, listener feedback survey. If you have listeners, encourage them to take the feedback survey, a Google form that you can make up saying, who are you? Where are you from? How did you find out about the podcast? All those little things so that you can determine, okay, did my marketing tactic work or did it not work? Am I reaching the target audience I thought I am? And if I'm not, is that okay? Or do I need to pivot my marketing ideas so I go towards the marketing or the target audience I intended?
Gosh,
Hopefully that helps.
Yes. Okay. Alyssa from Breakfast in Beauclair, everyone, which I've listened to. She sounds great. I saw AdvertiseCast is starting to pay to play accelerator program that's $15 a month for a podcast promo marketplace, guest appearance marketplace, and other unspecified resources for shows with 100 to 5,000 downloads first 30 days. Are programs like these actually valuable for emerging shows? Have you heard of this?
So I've seen, well, the specific example you gave, I don't know of them. I've heard of something like this taking place in the last year or so as podcasting has become even more of a thing. I'll be honest, my gut instinct is to not do it. Don't go into a pay for play situation. If the individual or the agency is reputable, if you can get stats from them about the success rate of their podcast productions that they've been working with, if you can get a sense of where your money is going into, exactly what your money is going into, consider it. But I feel like a lot of these things, if you're starting out, it maybe start off small and start doing this yourself and seeing what works and what doesn't. Because if you're hiring someone to do the work for you, they should know you. They should have a good track record. Otherwise, you're kind of investing in something that's not going to pan out. So I would just be cautious and do some more research.
Okay. From Michael Shannon to everyone, my show is a fictional story. I've had trouble figuring out how to narrow down my audience and how those analytics can help me. How do I target specific people when my show isn't about a lifestyle, hobby, etc.?
So what kind of podcast is it again?
It's a fictional story.
Okay. Well, I mean, I would just say that if it's a fictional story, then you're kind of in the audio drama camp, right? And also I would say there's probably an age demographic, right? I mean, are you doing a fictional story in the sense that it's children's fictional stories that children listen to and families listen to? Or is it something that's a little bit more adult? So you're kind of getting into people that would listen to other similar podcasts like Welcome to Night Vale. I would actually pose the question to you, what are similar podcasts out there or other media or social media accounts, whatever the case may be, that are similar to yours? And then maybe you can gauge a little bit more of who your target audience is in terms of age, in terms of interest, because that's going to help answer your question a little bit further. I am sure there's a target audience for what you have, and knowing that's going to help you out in marketing even further.
Okay. Trisha asks, and I think we may have already answered most of this, but she said, what are the essentials of a podcast trailer and what is an audiogram? I think you've covered what an audiogram is in the chat, and they sent headliner.
Yes.
But do you want to touch on the essentials of a podcast trailer?
Absolutely can. Or? Yeah. So podcast trailer is very similar, like I mentioned earlier, to a television promo or to a movie trailer, back when we can actually go to movie theaters and see movies. So something under 3 minutes, something that is going to be a sense of what your podcast is about or what your season or series is going to be about. So is it a montage of interview clips from the season coming up? Is it you kind of sharing a little bit about yourself and why you made this podcast or what the podcast is it going to be about? Again, it's if you have an elevator pitch, but maybe an extended elevator pitch, an elevator ride of about 3 minutes or less, can you share what this is going to be for the audience? Who the target, if you're listening to this podcast, this new season, you're going to get this out of it. You're going to want to listen because X reason. You're going to be the perfect, you're going to, gain so much insight because we have on X, Y, and Z guests. Again, it's just a sample. It's like a, I wouldn't say a mixtape, but it's a like a preview of what's to come.
Okay. April asks, any recommendation for creating podcast handles versus just using my personal brand name handle? That's the struggle she has.
Well, I would say that we had a really great session yesterday about branding, and a question brought up about personal branding versus podcast branding. I think it depends on the individual. If you feel like your personal brand is something that's bigger than your podcast, or it's something more personal than your podcast and you want to keep it separate, then so be it. Create that second channel that is devoted entirely to the podcast production. The one thing I would also say is, what is your voice? And not your voice as in your talking voice, but what is the tone? Because if you're going to be doing a social media account dedicated to your podcast, is that going to be the tone of the podcast? Is it going to be the tone of the host, you, that is posting on the social media of the podcast social media handle? Is the tone going to reflect who you are as a person versus what the podcast tone is? Because they could be two totally separate things. So I guess just to sum it up, by all means, you're welcome to have your personal handle be where you also promote your podcast. Will your friends and family be a little, annoyed by the fact they're always getting promotions for your podcast? Probably, but just considerations for you. If you want to do a separate one from your personal, do it. But again, consider target audience. Is your target audience going to want to hear more from you as a person as you post from that podcast social media handle, or something else?
Okay. Is there an appropriate format or specific kinds of information that needs to be given when sending a pitch out?
Yes. Yes. So what I would say is, one, don't make it long. Reporters and writers, there's no need for them to get back to you, but the shorter the better, so that way they can read it, they understand it, and if they have questions or want to follow up, they can. And by short, I mean, think of it as, again, like a 30-second pitch. If you had 30 seconds with a reporter or an anchor on the phone and you said, look, I'm reaching out because I see that you've done previous reporting or writing on this topic or about this person, and I want you to know that I have a podcast. Is it a brand new podcast? Is it a podcast celebrating an anniversary? Is it a podcast that's reached a milestone? If it's something newsworthy, by all means, share that it's newsworthy. Give them a hook that they can connect the news to, and that will make it even better for them. And also in the email, include, links to your website, links to a recent episode that's relevant, maybe a logo to your podcast, or if you've won any awards. But again, I would keep it on the shorter side. And if you don't hear back from the news outlet or the writer within a week or 2 weeks, follow up again in a nice way, saying, hey, want to circle back, want to see if you're interested. If not, no worries, but would love to talk further. And if they say no, then just be grateful. Say, thank you so much. Really appreciate the consideration, and hope to connect at a later date. And
Okay.
That's okay.
Great. Lori asks, is there a resource list for websites that provide all these services, graphics, advertising, marketing, copy, etc.?
So I guess individually, there are programs that can help with marketing, in the sense that, do you need a social media graphic? Do you need to make a video? Do you need to do this, that? And they're in that, Canva, Headliner, whatnot. But if you're talking about like basically a podcast marketing consultancy, or
like a website that says all things podcasting marketing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Google.
I would say, I hate to say it, but there are probably marketers or podcast marketers wherever you live, in your community, in your state. We are remote, though, obviously, during the pandemic. So I would just say, as a resource, Podcast Movement has a Facebook page. She Podcast, SHE Podcast, has a Facebook page.
Mm-hmm.
They're active communities. And within those communities are people who are podcast marketers, who you can pay to basically help you in creating a plan, or in them actually acting as your social media manager or marketer. So I would say She Podcast with an S at the end, or Podcast Movement. Either one of those Facebook groups can be really helpful if you want to post to them, I'm looking for a social media marketer. I'm looking for someone to help me pitch my podcast abroad.
I get random people all the time pitching me, hey, do you want help promoting your podcast? And it's just like some guy that has 4 followers. And I'm just like, I don't think you can help.
Yeah. Again, ask for their credentials. Ask them, what are your successes? What are the recent clients that you've had? It's what you put into it. And if you just want to give it willy-nilly to someone, then the results are going to be probably willy-nilly.
So Nikki asked, and I think it was, you were talking about when you drop your trailer, but she said within the first month. Does that refer to the month the trailer drops, or the first episode?
Yeah, so it's, again, sadly, Apple and the other podcast apps are they're a little secretive about it, but the rule of thumb is that hopefully within the first month of the first episode going up, that's when it's going to gain traction. because the Apple podcast feed, they're not really wanting to feature you if you just simply have like a 3-minute trailer up. What they're going to want to do is feature you when you have an episode up or a few episodes up. I saw a comment here asking, is it better to have 3 episodes up in one time if you're wanting to get the national podcast app feature?
Yeah, that was kind of the next question.
It can be helpful if you have a few episodes up at the same time. But again, there's not exactly a stat saying you're going to have a 20% increase in effectiveness if you have more episodes up to allow for a better feature. So again, rule of thumb, in the first month of the first episode going up, that's when you want a lot of traction going up.
What is your recommendation of how to acquire the technical skills to manage the work if somebody's thinking about starting a podcast? I know it's not really a question.
Good question. I will say that the 4th week of our podcast festival, the Charlotte Podcast Festival, is devoted to long-term goals and longevity in podcasting and how to avoid burnout and project management. I would highly recommend signing up for those sessions as they go more in depth, and you can do so on the website, which is charlottepodcastfestival.com. But just very briefly, I will say that at the end of the day, it is up to you and your resources and your abilities. If this is a passion project and you have a little bit of time, then you need to focus on what that time can be used for. If that means using it mostly for recording or editing, then do it, because at the end of the day, that is your podcast. Or if you can focus 10 minutes each day to marketing and social media marketing, focus on that. If you have more of a budget, then invest it in what you want to do with this podcast. But just you can use an Excel spreadsheet, you can use an Outlook calendar, you can use checklists to keep track of everything. There's no perfect strategy for balancing work and life and podcasting. So if someone else knows how to do that, please reach out to me, because 10 years in and I still don't have the right answer.
Yes. Cassandra asks, she's going into season 2 of her podcast, but season 1 was like a soft launch for her. She said, is it too late to be featured on New and Noteworthy? I guess that depends on how many episodes were in your first season, right?
Yeah, and I would say that there are a few different sections for features in Apple Podcast and a few other apps. I mean, some of them are thematic. Some of them are based off, like, if it's a month devoted to Black podcasters or Asian American podcasters, then they'll do features of those podcasters or any other theme happening. The politics of the November election coming up. There'll probably be, if there's not already, an election playlist of podcasts based off states or national politics. So sometimes it's less about the first episode launching and getting a groundswell of support as it is doing something that is thematic and seeing that groundswell for support, even if you're a podcast that's been running for a year or so. So, I mean, again, if you feel like you are hitting on something right now that is relevant to a national conversation for a national feature, then go ahead, put all your promotional value into asking your listeners, hey, it's really going to make a difference right now. Go ahead and listen and share this with friends and subscribe and rate and review it in this next month. And if you need an incentive to do so, we're going to give away a $10 Target gift card, or we're going to give away a item of swag with our podcast logo on it. Doesn't hurt.
Yeah, that's great. Janice asked, and I think we kind of maybe have already answered this, but maybe you'll have something else to add, but she want to know, are there podcasting consultants who help us choose which marketing ideas are most suitable for us and to develop a customized plan? I mean, I know most people that advertise are like, hey, they're influencers or whatever that will help market you, but is that a thing?
Yeah, I mean, they're probably, yes. But again, I feel like the podcast consultants that would have that knowledge of what works best for you are the ones that are going to either have a lot of great prior experience in podcast consulting or podcast marketing or marketing consulting in general. So if they're brand new to this, they may not have that experience. You may not want to go to them. Again, I would just say find the social media communities I mentioned earlier, She Podcast or Podcast Movement, and search, because there are databases out there of people working in this line of work that, maybe they have more knowledge of regional podcasting or genre podcasting or a type of podcast marketing, and they can better, answer that.
Yeah, I'll say when it comes to the Podcast Movement Facebook group, really take the time and comb through. There's so many people and so many comments nonstop on there. Like, I tried to ask a question. They're like, you have to search through. I'm sure this was covered. And I didn't even have time. Like, you have to sit down and look through all of it because there's so much content on there.
Yeah. And I would just say too, I mean, we covered a She podcast, like SHE Judy, like she, like woman, like SHE
Ladies,
podcast.
she's
Yeah.
cheap.
So I wish it was sheep. That'd be so cute.
I'm sure there is a sheep podcast. There's everything you've ever thought of is out there.
There is. And next session, we're going to talk about how to market your sheep podcast. I'm kidding,
Yes.
we're not. But folks, I want to be mindful of time. We're just a few minutes over
Yeah, I think we're
1
good.
o'clock Eastern. But I just want to remind everyone that this session has been recorded and the PowerPoint presentation will be sent out immediately. The video recording will go up at the end of the month. So just keep an eye on your emails for that. And also one more thing, feel free to stay connected with me. I'd be more than happy to learn more about your podcast and stay in the know of podcast related outings. You can find me at A Change of Tune on social media. And also this full week is about marketing communications. So if you have a further question about website, social media, PR, pitching, whatever the case may be, I encourage you to sign up right now. Don't delay. Space is limited. The registration is free though. You can go to charlottepodcastfestival.com.
Can we all clap for Joni? Put up the clap reaction, or let's hear for Joni Deutsch. I don't know if everybody realizes how lucky we are to have Joni Deutsch. I do, but we are. I mean, this is a free thing, and this was so much information. Joni, everybody's so right in the comments to say that you did a fabulous job, Joni, as always. Thank you for being you, and thank you for giving us access to your brain for this hour. Joni Deutsch is the best, and I'm not lying. When people hear me on the phone with Joni Deutsch, like, are you on the phone with Joni Deutsch? You know Joni Deutsch? So she's a super celebrity in Charlotte here, and she's awesome. So thank you, Joni Deutsch.
Thank you. And thanks to Joe, too, for being a great moderator. And of course, everyone, we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. And if you do want to stay in touch with us, we have 1.5 more weeks of podcast festival sessions ranging from legal considerations to monetization and beyond. So we hope that you see you and share about this on social media. If you enjoyed it, if you learned something new, feel free to use the hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. That's hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. And also pick up one of these cool t-shirts that help support the cause. And you may just be able to receive it in the next week or so you can wear it on one of our final session calls.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Pod safely.